You can't have a single conversation about the de Havilland Mosquito without someone bringing up the fact that it was made of wood. Seriously, just mention the name to anyone with a passing familiarity with military aviation, and it will probably be the first fact they state about the Mozzie. Which is true, admittedly, though tends to simplify just how clever the engineering and technology applied by de Havilland to what is probably their most famous product was. Plus, it overlooks the fact that wood and other materials were used in loads of aircraft during the Second World War. Admittedly, when it comes to the brilliance of non-alloy construction, the Mosquito turned the dial up to 11, and wood in particular was an eminently sensible material for most aircraft producing countries to want to use in their designs. It, along with steel, was generally cheap and available, something that was often not the case for the complex and expensive aluminium alloys that aircraft were often using in their construction by the late 1930s. So, though the ideal was to design and build aircraft with all alloy construction, the reality was that this wouldn't always be an option, especially in any large-scale conflict. As a result, many aircraft were designed to use what were classed as non-strategic materials, wherever possible, so as to alleviate pressures on the supplies of critical metals like aluminium. Heck, I've covered plenty of them on this channel in the past. Links to some I'll put in the panels at the end. Plus, this wasn't just a wartime measure. Concerns over access to enough strategic materials meant that even before the war, the prospective combatants started thinking about the issue and requesting designs that would use more non-alloy parts and structures in their construction. And one of the best examples of this is the aircraft I want to look at today, the Armstrong Whitworth Albemarle. In January 1938, the British issued a specification for a new medium bomber that was to use as little aircraft alloy in its construction as possible, with the instruction being that the new design should use non-strategic materials, i.e. wood and steel. Additionally, the aircraft should ideally be capable of being constructed by factories not already involved in aircraft production, so as to allow this additional manufacturing capacity to be used in the event of war breaking out and help alleviate the pressures on the aircraft companies. Even as the specification was being drawn up and feelers put out to Armstrong Whitworth, Bristol and de Havilland to see if they were interested in bidding, the Air Ministry decided to tweak the requirements, changing it from a pure bomber to a long-range reconnaissance machine with bombing capability. Both Bristol and Armstrong Whitworth submitted design proposals for the specification, but as Bristol was rather busy with existing work building as many Blenheim and Beaufort bombers as possible, as well as developing a new and very interesting design that would become the Beaufighter, they quickly dropped out, leaving Armstrong Whitworth the only contender. In October 1938, an order for 200 of the Armstrong Whitworth design, classified by the company as the AW41 and soon to have the official name of Albemarle, was placed straight off the drawing board. Manufacture of these was to be conducted by a shadow factory run by the Gloucester Aircraft Company, while another 800 would be manufactured at another purpose-built factory for the type that was being built in the north of England near Bradford. It might seem a little rash ordering an unbuilt and untested aircraft like this in such numbers, but such were the concerns over potential aluminium shortage in the British Air Ministry that having some sort of backup seemed a good idea. And on the face of it, the design incorporated some clever and advanced ideas. As had been requested, the Albemarle was of mixed construction, with the aircraft structure being composed of steel tubing, while the aircraft was almost completely skinned in plywood, with the only light alloy components being used in part of the wing leading edge. Armstrong Whitworth also cleverly designed the aircraft to be in effectively 3 sections, meaning that these could be constructed at different workshops and then the whole aircraft assembled at another location. This idea meant that the Albemarle's production line would be geographically diversified, making it difficult to disrupt, plus give the possibility of damaged aircraft being quickly returned to service by simply removing the affected section and replacing it as a complete unit. And though Armstrongs had been instructed to make the Albemarle as simple a design as possible, they did manage to fit one interesting and modern feature into the design: a tricycle undercarriage. This was a first for an operational British-made aircraft and would cause some issues with trim which, naturally, would be altered by whether the undercarriage was up or down. The solution adopted was to have either a block of lead or concrete, different sources disagree on which exactly, which would slide up and down the fuselage on a pulley system to balance the aircraft. Unfortunately, it would also lead to the loss of at least one aircraft when the pulley system was disconnected by maintenance personnel, and the flight crew didn't realise that fact until it was too late for them. However, this solution does seem to have been generally successful and gives an indication that the Albemarle, while deliberately outdated in its construction methods, did play a part in furthering design ideas and knowledge at the time. Armstrong Whitworth initially intended the aircraft to use two of the ubiquitous Rolls-Royce Merlins, but this was soon changed in the initial design phase for the aircraft to instead use the Bristol Hercules radials, which produced just under 1,600 horsepower each. Defensive armament was to be four 303 Browning machine guns in a dorsal turret, with another pair located in a ventral one. In addition to this, the payload was 4,500 pounds of bombs carried internally. With its mid-wing layout and rather smooth lines, it was, I would say, a good-looking aircraft, and in 1938 the projected capabilities were perfectly reasonable. But despite all the activity and hopes around the aircraft, the Albemarle would have troubles from the start. The Hercules engine had some development issues, which delayed things for a year, principally around the development of what was called the power egg, which allowed the complete engine system to be removed and replaced as a single unit. This meant that development was stalled with the Albemarle when war broke out in September 1939, and the Gloucester factory created to build the aircraft was quickly wrapped up in repairing damage to Hurricane and Gladiator fighters, which slowed things down. Plus, when the first prototype was completed and began flight trials in March 1940, the reports were that takeoff was very sluggish, and the aircraft needed to be redesigned to improve on this. Needless to say, this all led to substantial delays, and considering that the Albemarle was intended to be primarily a reserve aircraft, it wasn't exactly a priority for effort, which further compounded the problem. Testing continued through 1940-41, including a hair-raising episode where a section of the plywood skin came off, causing the first prototype aircraft to go into a spin. The pilot ordered the rest of the crew to bail out, but one of them got caught up on the fuselage, and his parachute got snagged on the aircraft's tail, which miraculously corrected the spin and allowed the pilot to land the aircraft. Remarkably, no one was killed, as the observer who got hung up was able to cut himself free just as the aircraft came into land and hit a snowdrift. He was badly injured, but survived to explain what had happened. All the delays meant that the Albemarle, whose performance was acceptable in the pre-war years, was recognised as essentially obsolete as a combat aircraft even as testing ensued, and this meant that it continued to be shunted further and further down the priority listings. The testing and production schedule continued to be pushed back, not aided by the fact that Armstrong Whitworth, understandably very busy already, couldn't really be bothered with the aircraft anymore, nor that the aircraft on the production lines couldn't be delivered because things like engines and propellers were being diverted to higher priority types. So it wasn't actually until January 1943 that Albemarles actually got into service with the RAF. Considering that the plan had been for all 1,000 of the original order to be delivered by January 1942, that gives an indication of how far the whole project had gotten behind. As already said, well before this point, it was recognised that the aircraft was not going to make it as a bomber. The penalties the Albemarle paid with the deliberate choice to employ steel and wood instead of aircraft alloys would tell on the aircraft's performance, making it notably inferior to the principal British medium bomber of the time, the Vickers Wellington. This aircraft, which used the same power plant as the Albemarle, had the same payload, but also had a better range, speed, and a more effective defensive armament. The British had ample production of the Wellington ongoing, plus they were receiving substantial numbers of medium bombers from the United States by this point, notably the Martin Baltimore. So it wasn't with Bomber Command that the Albemarle was primarily utilised, it was with the RAF's transport squadrons. In fact, the decision had been made in 1941 that the future role of the Albemarle would be as a transport, glider tower, and paratroop delivery vehicle. At that time, the RAF was desperately deficit in airlift capacity, with really only the Bristol Bombay available as a home-built dedicated transport, and American purchases primarily aimed at combat types. Many of the RAF's transport squadrons were actually operating a previous Armstrong Whitworth design, the Whitley Heavy Bomber. These obsolete aircraft had been repurposed as transports and were even less suitable for that job than the Albemarles, so being the Whitley's replacement in the transport role was convenient. Plus, the Albemarle was being built, albeit slowly, on lines established for it that didn't use other production facilities, so there is some logic to the choice, though it wasn't exactly an ideal design for the roles. Consideration was also given to employing the type as a maritime patrol aircraft or as a torpedo bomber, and Coastal Command did run trials with the Albemarle to assess the type. They apparently didn't like it, and it was into the cargo and towing roles that the aircraft was inserted. Albemarles were built in various configurations, normally with a hatch in the floor for paratrooper dropping, a large cargo hatch on the starboard side, and many with towing hitches. The defensive armament was also changed, normally to twin machine guns in a dorsal position. But because it was a bit of an ad hoc conversion, the Albemarle only had a maximum cargo capacity of 4,000 pounds or 10 paratroopers. This was hardly a great payload for what was a pretty expensive aircraft, but it was available, and so the Albemarle is what got issued. Once the Albemarle started being fielded, despite their limitations, they found themselves in great demand. Albemarles ran the critical mail route between the UK and Gibraltar, and then were sent to North Africa, where they were used in the invasion of Sicily. They also found constant employment in Northern Europe, initially dropping agents and special forces into occupied territory, as well as conducting leaflet raids, and on 2 occasions reverting to their original bomber role and hitting enemy targets in France. They would then go on to perform their most critical career missions, dropping paratroopers and towing gliders for the invasion of Europe in June 1944. In fact, Albemarles were credited with dropping the first Allied troops of D-Day, when they were employed to drop the Pathfinders of the British 6th Airborne Division early on the morning of June 6th. Albemarles were also heavily involved in Operation Market Garden, the infamous Bridge Too Far airborne assault on a series of bridges in the Netherlands. All told, some 602 Albemarles were built, 2 of which were prototypes, and then 32 of the original bomber variant, after which all the others were built as transports and towers. Of the aircraft delivered, 17 were lost on operations and another 81 in accidents. The rather ersatz nature of the Albemarle meant that it was never that popular, and the type was replaced as quickly as possible, either with properly designed transports or by converted 4-engine bombers, principally the Short Stirling and Handley Page Halifax. Yes, more bodge-up designs, but much bigger and more powerful than the now very humble-looking Albemarle, which was completely replaced in service by February 1946. Honestly, the Albemarle does represent a bit of an oddity. While the original idea seemed sensible, to build what was effectively a backup design using non-strategic materials in the event of war, the problems and slow pace of the aircraft in development does make one wonder why the British persisted with the aircraft at all. I have indeed seen it wondered at many times, principally on online forums, why the British didn't simply scrap the whole programme and start with a clean sheet design for a proper transport. Indeed, in 1941 the Albemarle was subject to parliamentary scrutiny, with Churchill himself asking what was happening with it and asking whether it should be scrapped. But as I have said, the British had a critical shortage of transport aircraft, having to fill the role with obsolete bombers taken off the front line, and while a proper transport would no doubt be preferable, how long would it have been before it could be available? The Albemarle by that point was well along in its development cycle, problematic though that may have been, and was even in low rate production. It was, basically, what was available. And that explains the final part of the story which I have not so far covered, the export of Albemarles to the Soviet Union. In October 1942, the Soviets approached the British and requested that they provide them with 100 modern transport aircraft. The British only had one thing available, the Albemarle, which wasn't even in operational service with the RAF at that point, and so a conversion squadron for the Red Air Force was set up in Scotland so that they could learn to use the type. Unfortunately, that incident I mentioned before about the aircraft that was lost when the undercarriage counterweight was disconnected involved one of these Soviet trading aircraft, and the loss of the entire crew, including Major Alexander Grustin, a recipient of the Hero of the Soviet Union, their highest award, did little to endear the aircraft to the Russians. In total, the Soviets took delivery of 14 Albemarles, 2 of which were lost in the long flight back to Russia, but they found the type very limited and so cancelled the order in 1943, preferring to wait for deliveries of American C-47s instead. I would say that was fair enough, but for the British, for whom air transport was absolutely critical in their far-flung campaigns all over the world, waiting for American aid to fill the capacity gap really wasn't an option. Yes, I'm sure the RAF would have much preferred Dakotas all around, but so did everyone else. And with global requirements and the fact that they had started the war with an aerial transport service extremely poorly equipped to deal with the huge demands that it suddenly found being thrust upon it, they had to take what was available, and that was the Albemarle. The Albemarle is thus a classic case of something being better than nothing. It might have been far from ideal for the job it did, but it did it. Huge thanks to John at the Dinger Aviation website. He trawled through his archives to find some excellent articles on the Albemarle that I used extensively for the research for this video. Link in the description to the Dinger site. Check it out. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and have a good one everyone. With a bit of luck, I'll see you all again soon.